On my way home from work, my home security camera activated. On it, I saw my mother in the living room, coaching my 8-year-old daughter. In court, I'm gonna say he touched me here. My daughter was pointing at her private parts, while my mother hugged her and told her she was a good girl. I almost swerved off the road, watching my daughter smile about how she was going to ruin my life in 3 weeks' time. The surprise Build-A-Bear I'd bought her was laughing at me from the back seat. The photos of Julie my mother had sent earlier now seemed contaminated. But instead of getting angry and acting on impulse like college me would have, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I sewed a recording device into the Build-A-Bear before driving home. "Grandma's here," Julie squealed when I walked through the door 20 minutes later, running to me with the same innocent face that had just been rehearsing my destruction. "I know, sweetheart," I said, handing her the Build-A-Bear. "Mr. Snuggles has a new friend for you." My mother smiled that grandmother smile I'd trusted for 42 years. "You spoil her, Daniel. How was work?" "The usual." I kissed Julie's forehead, my stomach churning. "Thanks for watching her, Mom." Over the next 2.5 weeks, I became the world's greatest actor. I installed cameras in Julie's dollhouse, her jewelry box, even inside the old tablet she used for games. Every device was legally purchased and placed in my own home, in items I'd bought. My lawyer would later call it genius. Tuesday, my mother brought Disney brochures to my daughter. "For after the bad man goes away," she whispered to Julie, who was ecstatic about the holiday and seemed to have no idea of the consequences she was doing. On Thursday, they practiced Julie's testimony again. "Remember, baby, tears help. The judge needs to see you're scared of Daddy." On Saturday, she gave Julie a new American Girl doll. "This is for being such a brave girl about our secret." Each night, I'd transfer the recordings to 3 separate cloud services and a physical drive in my office safe. Then I'd tuck my daughter in, bringing her milk and cookies before calling her a good girl. It wasn't her fault. She had Down syndrome and didn't understand the gravity situation. I couldn't be mad at her. When young children do bad things, you point the finger at the adults in their life. The court date arrived 3 weeks later. The room was packed for what everyone thought was day 3 of our custody battle. Jessica, my ex-wife, sat with her lawyer, looking confident. She'd been pushing for full custody with supervised visits only. My siblings sat behind my mother. "Your Honor," Jessica's lawyer announced, "we'd like to call Julie Grimes to the stand." My 8-year-old daughter walked in clutching her Build-A-Bear. She wouldn't look at me. The bailiff helped her onto the witness stand, adjusting the microphone to her height. "Julie, sweetheart," Jessica's lawyer said, "I know this is scary, but can you tell the judge what you told your mommy and grandma?" Julie's little voice shook. Daddy touches me in bad places." The courtroom gasped. Jessica dabbed her eyes. My mother reached over to squeeze Jessica's hand in support. "Where does he touch you?" Julie pointed to her private areas. "There. He says it's our special secret." I felt my lawyer's hand on my arm, keeping me seated. My siblings were staring at me in horror. "How long has this been happening, Julie?" "A long time. He said if I told anyone, Mommy would get hurt." Jessica broke into performative sobs. The CPS workers were furiously taking notes. The judge's face had turned to stone. "Julie, one last question," the lawyer continued. "Do you feel safe with your daddy?" Julie started crying, coached tears. "No, I'm scared of him. I want to live with Mommy and Grandma forever." No further questions. The judge looked at my lawyer. "Does the defense wish to cross-examine?" "Your Honor," my lawyer stood. "Before we proceed, we need to submit critical evidence that will recontextualize this testimony." "This is a delay tactic," Jessica's lawyer protested. "Your Honor, I have 18 days of video evidence that this child has been coached to give false testimony." The judge's eyebrows raised. "That's a serious accusation, counselor. The Build-A-Bear she's holding contains a recording device I legally placed there. It has captured her grandmother coaching her on this exact testimony for 3 weeks." My mother's face went white. Jessica's confident expression cracked. "I'll review this in chambers," the judge said. 5 minutes later, he returned, his face dark with rage. "Clear the courtroom except for essential parties. Now." Once the room emptied, my lawyer connected his laptop to the courtroom screen. The first video started playing. My mother's voice filled the room. "Now, Julie, remember what we practiced. When the judge asks, you say Daddy touched you here." Julie's voice on the recording. "But he didn't, Grandma." The CPS worker's pen stopped moving. The next video was worse. "Julie, you need to cry when you say it. Real tears. Think about your hamster that died. Grandma, I don't want Daddy to go to jail. He won't go to jail if you do this right. He just won't see you anymore. Then you get that trip to Disney World." "Turn it off!" Jessica screamed, standing up. "This is entrapment." "There's 17 more days of this," my lawyer said calmly, including conversations where Mrs. Dickerson and Mrs. Grimes discussed the coaching strategy. The judge turned to Julie, his voice gentle but firm. "Julie, is what you told us today true?" Julie clutched her Build-A-Bear tighter and looked down at the floor for what felt like forever before her small voice finally came out. "Grandma said if I told the truth, Daddy would be mad at me." The entire courtroom went completely silent as the judge leaned forward in his chair, his face changing from stern to something softer. "Julie, sweetheart, can you tell me what Grandma told you to say?" My daughter's fingers played with the bear's fuzzy ears, while tears rolled down her face. She said I had to say Daddy touched me in bad places, or he would take me away forever. The judge's jaw tightened as he looked over at my mother, who had gone completely white. "But did your daddy actually touch you in those places, Julie?" My daughter shook her head no, and I felt my whole body start shaking with relief and anger at the same time. "No, he never did that, but Grandma said I had to say it for the Disney trip." The judge immediately stood up, and his voice boomed across the courtroom. "Bailiff, please escort this child to chambers with a CPS worker immediately." Jessica jumped up from her seat, screaming that I was manipulating everyone and forcing Julie to lie, but her lawyer grabbed her arm hard and pulled her back down into her chair. My mother just sat there frozen like a statue, her face drained of all color, while the bailiff gently helped Julie down from the witness stand. The CPS worker took Julie's hand and led her through a side door, while Jessica kept shouting about how this was all a setup. 20 minutes passed before we were called back into session, and now Julie's chair sat empty at the witness stand. The judge's face looked like carved stone as he stared down at all of us from his bench. "I have reviewed enough of these recordings to know that this child was systematically coached to commit perjury in my courtroom." His voice was so cold, it made everyone shift in their seats. Jessica's lawyer immediately stood up, requesting time to review all the evidence, claiming they hadn't received proper discovery of these recordings. My lawyer calmly stood and explained that every single recording was made legally in my own home on devices I personally purchased and owned. The judge cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Motion denied. We will proceed immediately with reviewing this evidence." He turned his computer screen toward the courtroom and hit play on the first recording. My mother's voice filled the room crystal clear. "Now remember, Julie, after Daddy goes away, we're going to Disney World just like I promised." Julie's little voice responded on the recording. "But I want Daddy to come too." My mother's voice again. "No, sweetie, Daddy can't come because he's been bad. Remember what we practiced?" Jessica started crying, but these tears looked different from her fake ones earlier, more panicked and desperate. My siblings in the back row shifted around in their seats, avoiding eye contact with everyone, including each other. The judge played 3 more recordings, each one showing my mother coaching Julie on exactly what to say and how to cry on command. After the 4th recording finished, the judge stopped the playback and turned directly to the CPS workers sitting in the front row. "I'm ordering an immediate emergency safety assessment for this child effective right now." His voice left no room for argument. "The grandmother is to have absolutely no unsupervised contact with this child starting immediately." One of the CPS workers started writing furiously in her notebook, while the other one stepped out to make a phone call. The judge then looked at both lawyers and announced he was appointing a guardian ad litem to represent Julie's interests, completely separate from both parents. "I'm scheduling an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning at 9 sharp, and I'm warning everyone in this courtroom that criminal referrals are likely." Jessica's lawyer leaned over, whispering urgently in her ear, while my mother finally broke down, sobbing loudly. That evening around 6:30, 2 CPS workers showed up at my front door with clipboards and serious expressions. Julie was staying with a court-approved supervisor for the night, which killed me inside, but I understood it was necessary. The lead worker, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, asked me detailed questions about how I discovered the coaching and why I chose to record it. I walked her through Julie's room, showing her exactly where I had placed each camera, pulling out receipts from my filing cabinet to prove I owned every single device. She examined the dollhouse with its tiny camera, the jewelry box, and the old tablet, taking pictures of everything with her phone. The second worker, a younger man with glasses, took notes about every single thing in Julie's room, from her medication schedule for her Down syndrome to her favorite books on the shelf. They asked about my daily routine with Julie, her therapy appointments, her special education plan at the school, every detail of our life together. I showed them my calendar with all her appointments highlighted in pink, her favorite color. The lead worker seemed satisfied that everything was legal and above board, but she expressed concern about the psychological impact all this coaching might have had on Julie. She pulled out her phone and scheduled a forensic interview for Julie within the next 48 hours at a special child advocacy center downtown. As soon as the CPS workers left, my phone started going crazy with notifications. Text after text from family members who had been in court, each one with their own opinion about what had happened. My brother called me directly, and the first words out of his mouth were that I was a monster for spying on a child. I tried to explain that I was protecting Julie from being used as a weapon, but he hung up on me. My sister sent a long text saying she was confused and didn't know what to believe anymore, that our mother would never do something like this. I didn't respond to any of them, just turned my phone on silent and sat in Julie's empty room holding the Build-A-Bear that had saved both our lives. The next morning came way too fast, and I barely slept. Just kept checking my phone for updates from my lawyer about the emergency hearing at 9. The courtroom was smaller this time, just the judge's chambers with wood panels everywhere, and a big table where we all sat around looking serious. The guardian ad litem, a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tight, spread out a stack of papers in front of her and started going through what she'd found after staying up all night reviewing my recordings. She counted 17 different times over 3 weeks, where my mother coached Julie about what to say, including 4 sessions where they practiced crying on command, and 6 where they went over the exact words to use about being touched. She pulled out her laptop and showed the judge a spreadsheet she'd made, tracking every coaching session with timestamps and quotes, recommending Julie needed therapy right away to help her understand what really happened versus what she was told to say. Jessica's lawyer jumped up, waving papers around, claiming the recordings were illegal, that I'd violated privacy laws by recording without consent, that none of it should count as evidence. My lawyer stayed calm and pulled out his own stack of papers, showing receipts for every device, the registration documents proving I owned them, photos of my own home where they were placed, and a thick legal brief explaining how parents have every right to monitor their own homes and their own children's belongings for safety. The judge took all the papers and said he'd think about it, but for now the recordings would stay as evidence since they showed potential child endangerment. After lunch, the guardian ad litem asked me to come to my lawyer's office for an interview, and I sat there for 2 hours answering her questions about why I didn't just confront my mother when I first heard the coaching. I explained how scared I was that nobody would believe me, that Jessica and my mother would just deny everything and maybe even get Julie to change her story if they knew I was onto them, that I needed solid proof or I'd lose my daughter forever. She wrote everything down in a yellow notepad, asking follow-up questions about Julie's daily routine, her special needs related to Down syndrome, how often my mother watched her when I first noticed something was wrong. 2 days passed before Julie's forensic interview at this special building downtown that looked like a regular house from outside, but had cameras and special interview rooms inside. I had to wait in a separate room with magazines and a coffee machine while a trained interviewer spent 2 hours with Julie using dolls and drawings to help her explain what happened. The interviewer came out looking tired and told me Julie was confused about what was real and what was pretend, that she kept talking about practice games with Grandma and stories they made up together. Later that afternoon, the forensic interviewer's report came through showing Julie had clear signs of coaching with no signs of actual abuse, noting how Julie couldn't keep her story straight and kept mixing up what Grandma told her to say with things that really happened. The report said Julie needed therapy right away to help her sort out truth from lies, and even though I felt huge relief reading no abuse was found, I knew we still had a long road ahead. Jessica filed another emergency motion the next day, demanding I have zero contact with Julie until everything was sorted out, with her lawyer arguing my surveillance was creepy and would mess Julie up even more. The judge reviewed it that same afternoon in another emergency hearing where Jessica's lawyer kept using words like disturbing and obsessive to describe my recording, but the judge wasn't buying it. He denied Jessica's motion, but said all my time with Julie had to happen in therapy offices or supervised settings for now, not because he thought I did anything wrong, but to protect Julie while she worked through the confusion with professionals. It hurt hearing I couldn't just take my daughter home and tuck her in like normal, but I understood why they had to be careful. 3 days later, HR called me into their office because someone had called them about the child abuse investigation, and I had to sit there while they asked me questions about what was happening. I brought copies of all the court documents showing I was the one who exposed the false allegations, showing the judge's orders, showing the forensic report clearing me of any wrongdoing. They put me on paid leave anyway, saying it was just until everything got resolved in court, but I could tell they were uncomfortable with the whole situation. The guardian ad litem called me the next week saying she'd found something during a home visit to Jessica's apartment, that my mother was there even though the judge had ordered no contact between her and Julie. Jessica tried to claim she didn't know my mother couldn't be there, that she was just helping with groceries, but the guardian ad litem reported it to the judge immediately, and a contempt hearing got scheduled for 2 days later. During the contempt hearing, Jessica finally admitted she'd been living with my mother for the past month because she couldn't afford her apartment anymore after her hours got cut at work. The judge's face got red as he warned them both that any more violations would mean jail time, ordering my mother to stay completely away from both Jessica and Julie, with no exceptions. My lawyer filed the subpoena for Jessica's phone records that same afternoon, and we got them 3 days later. The text messages between her and my mother went back 3 whole months, way before any of this started. One message from my mother said clear as day that I would never see Julie again after this was done. Another text had Jessica asking if the coaching would really work, and my mother replying that it worked for her friend's daughter in Texas. There were dozens of messages planning exactly what Julie should say and when she should cry. My lawyer printed out every single message and added them to our growing pile of evidence. The judge approved Julie starting therapy with a specialist who knew about kids being coached to lie in custody cases. The therapist had worked on cases like this for 15 years and explained to me that it would take months to help Julie understand what really happened. She said Julie would need to learn the difference between the lies she was told to say and what was actually real. I was allowed to come to some sessions to help rebuild the trust between us. Our first joint session happened a week later in a small office with toys and books everywhere. Julie sat on the floor playing with blocks, while the therapist sat nearby on a cushion. I sat in a chair trying not to look scary or upset, even though my stomach was in knots. Julie looked up at me with those big eyes and asked if she was in trouble for lying about the bad touches. The therapist quickly told her she did nothing wrong, that grown-ups she loved told her the wrong things to say. I nodded and said the same thing, that she was a good girl who got confused by people who should have protected her. Julie hugged her Build-A-Bear tight and whispered she was sorry, which broke my heart into pieces. Meanwhile, CPS expanded their investigation to look at my mother's behavior with my brother's kids over the years. They found out she'd been warned twice before about not respecting boundaries with her other grandchildren. My brother had complained 5 years ago that she was telling his kids their parents were too strict. Another complaint came from my sister 3 years back when my mother tried to take her kids on vacation without asking first. Nothing criminal had happened, but the pattern was clear that my mother had control issues with all the grandkids. The CPS worker told me this pattern made them very worried about her influence on Julie. My lawyer also got Jessica's financial records through another subpoena that came back, showing she was drowning in debt. She was 3 months behind on rent and had maxed out 4 credit cards trying to keep up with bills. Her work had cut her hours 6 months ago, and she'd been struggling to pay for anything since then. The financial pressure explained why she was so desperate to get full custody with the maximum child support payment. My lawyer documented every late payment, every maxed card, every bounced check for our case file. During week 4 of therapy, Julie had a breakthrough that made the therapist's eyes go wide. Julie started talking about other practice games that Grandma had taught her over the past few months. She said Grandma showed her how to cry on command by thinking about sad movies or dead pets. There were games about what to tell teachers if they asked about bruises that didn't exist. Julie even practiced holding her arms around herself and looking scared when talking about Daddy. The therapist immediately called CPS to report these new details, while I sat there feeling sick about how deep this went. The guardian ad litem spent 2 weeks interviewing everyone and reviewing all the evidence before writing her report. She recommended I get primary custody with Jessica, only getting supervised visits until she completed parenting classes and therapy. Her report talked about severe psychological manipulation and the risk that Jessica would keep coaching Julie if left unsupervised. The report was 20 pages long and included quotes from the recordings, the therapy sessions, and all the professional evaluations. Jessica's lawyer filed an objection right away, claiming the guardian was biased against mothers, but the judge dismissed it immediately. Out of nowhere, my brother called me one evening to apologize for not believing me at first. He said the evidence was so overwhelming that he couldn't deny what happened anymore. He told me our mother had called him asking him to testify that I was violent in college, which was a complete lie. He refused to help her and told her she needed to accept what she'd done to Julie. Having even one family member see the truth felt like a small win in all this mess. The pediatrician who examined Julie submitted her report, finding 0 physical evidence that any abuse ever happened. She noted that Julie was healthy, well-fed, and developing normally for a child with Down syndrome. The doctor wrote that Julie showed secure attachment to me during the exam, reaching for me when scared and calming down when I held her hand. She also noted that Julie didn't show any of the physical or emotional signs typically seen in abused children. My lawyer added this report to our stack of evidence, proving the allegations were completely made up. 2 days before the final hearing, Jessica's lawyer called mine trying to work out a deal. They offered to have Jessica admit to poor judgment in listening to my mother, but wouldn't admit to actively coaching Julie. My lawyer didn't even consider it for a second, telling them we needed full accountability for what they put Julie through. The judge had already scheduled the final hearing for 2 weeks out, and we weren't backing down now. The next week, Julie's therapy session changed everything when she started telling the therapist about the different kinds of stories in her head. She pointed to her temple and said some stories were real, like going to the park with Daddy, and some were practice stories Grandma taught her. The therapist took notes while Julie sorted through her memories, putting them into 2 piles like she was organizing her toys. I watched through the one-way glass as my daughter worked through each memory, sometimes getting confused but mostly getting them right. The therapist explained afterward that this was huge progress, but warned me not to talk about any of this with Julie outside these sessions. She gave me a list of rules to follow, and I memorized every single one. 3 days later, HR called me into a meeting where they'd finished their investigation into the complaint someone had filed. They found nothing wrong on my part, but said company policy meant I had to stay on leave until the court case wrapped up. My supervisor walked me to my car afterward and told me quietly that everyone at work knew what really happened, and they all supported me. It helped knowing I wasn't completely alone in this mess, even if I couldn't go back to work yet. That same afternoon, My lawyer called to say the district attorney's office wanted to meet about possible criminal charges against Jessica and my mother. We sat in their conference room the next morning while they reviewed all the recordings and explained how hard it was to prosecute coaching cases. The prosecutor said they were taking it seriously, but warned that getting a conviction for this kind of manipulation was really complicated. I told them I just wanted Julie safe, but if they could hold Jessica and my mother accountable, that would help too. 2 weeks passed before Jessica's first unsupervised visit at the visitation center, where everything went wrong immediately. The supervisor later told me Jessica leaned close to Julie and whispered something about keeping their secret safe. Julie pulled away, looking scared, and the supervisor immediately ended the visit right there. She filed a report that afternoon documenting the violation, which meant Jessica lost her next 2 weeks of visits. The court ordered Jessica to undergo her own evaluation before she could see Julie again. My lawyer said this was exactly the kind of thing we expected, but it still made me angry that she'd try to manipulate Julie even now. A thick envelope arrived at my lawyer's office the next day from my mother's attorney with a letter inside offering to explain her side of everything. She wrote that she was just trying to protect Julie from what she thought was happening, and if I dropped the no-contact order, she could make me understand. My lawyer drafted a response saying all communication had to go through legal channels and included a cease and desist order. He told me she clearly didn't understand or accept what she'd done to Julie, which meant she was still dangerous. Julie had another breakthrough 3 weeks later during therapy when she finally talked about how she felt during all the coaching. She told the therapist she felt confused and scared when Grandma and Mommy told her different things than what really happened. She said her tummy hurt when they practiced the stories, and she didn't like keeping secrets from Daddy. The therapist documented all of this as evidence of Julie's growing ability to understand and process what they'd put her through. It broke my heart hearing about it later, but the therapist said this was necessary for Julie's healing. The morning of the final custody hearing arrived with news crews outside the courthouse and a packed courtroom inside. Family members filled the benches along with CPS workers and representatives from the guardian ad litem's office. Jessica walked in with a completely new lawyer since apparently her first one withdrew after seeing all the evidence. My mother tried to enter the courtroom, but security stopped her at the door since she wasn't allowed inside. The judge called the hearing to order and asked CPS to present their findings first. The lead investigator stood up and spent 40 minutes detailing everything they'd found during their investigation. She explained how the coaching had started months before the court date and were included specific examples from the recordings. She showed how Jessica and my mother had rehearsed Julie's testimony multiple times, rewarding her with gifts and promises. The investigator recommended therapy for Julie for at least a year and said Jessica should only have supervised visits until she completed parenting classes. She also noted that my mother posed an ongoing threat to Julie's mental health and shouldn't have any contact. Several family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the evidence mounted. The therapist took the stand next and explained Julie's confusion between truth and fiction after weeks of coaching. She described how the adults had exploited Julie's disability, knowing she wouldn't fully understand what they were asking her to do. She talked about Julie's progress in therapy, but emphasized that she still needed stability and protection from further manipulation. My sister got up and left the courtroom during this testimony, while my brother stared at the floor. The therapist's testimony lasted another 30 minutes, with detailed explanations of the psychological damage. Finally, the guardian ad litem stood to present her comprehensive report to the court. She laid out the documented pattern of coaching with dates, times, and specific quotes from the recordings. She explained the financial motivations behind Jessica's actions, showing bank statements and past due notices. She described Jessica's continued attempts to influence Julie, even during supervised visits, and my mother's complete lack of remorse. Her voice was firm and clear as she stated that both Jessica and my mother posed an ongoing risk to Julie's well-being. She recommended I receive primary custody, with Jessica getting only supervised therapeutic visits after completing extensive parenting education. The judge took notes throughout her presentation, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. The judge called Jessica to the stand next, and she walked up slowly, wearing a black dress that made her look smaller than usual. She raised her right hand for the oath and sat down, gripping the edges of the witness box so hard her knuckles went white. Her lawyer asked her to explain her side of the story, and she started talking about how she'd made some mistakes, but was only trying to protect Julie. She said she really believed something bad was happening because Julie had been acting different lately. When the judge asked about the coaching recordings, she looked down at her hands and said, "My mother had done everything on her own without telling her the whole plan." Nobody in the courtroom bought it for a second. The judge asked her 3 more times about specific conversations on the recordings, where she was clearly participating. Each time she tried to shift blame to my mother, or claim she didn't remember exactly what was said. During the break, 20 minutes later, I heard shouting in the hallway and saw security guards blocking my mother from entering the courtroom. She was yelling that I was destroying our family and that everyone would regret believing my lies. The guards had to physically hold her back as she tried to push past them. The judge came out of his chambers to see what was happening and told the court reporter to add this outburst to the official record. My mother kept screaming even as they escorted her out of the building. When court resumed, my lawyer called me to testify, and I walked to the stand feeling every eye in the room on me. The judge asked me to explain how I discovered the coaching, and I told him about overhearing Julie practicing her story in the car. I described setting up the recordings and making sure everything was legal before I did it. I talked about watching the footage each night and feeling sick, but knowing I needed to protect my daughter. The judge asked about my support system, and I listed the family members who still talked to me, my stable job, and the therapist I'd already contacted for Julie. I requested full custody with therapeutic visits for Jessica only when professionals said it was safe. The judge asked if I was prepared to be Julie's sole caregiver, and I said I'd been doing it mostly alone anyway. That afternoon, the judge delivered his ruling without even taking another recess to think about it. He gave me sole legal and physical custody of Julie immediately. Jessica would get supervised therapeutic visits only after completing approved parenting classes. He issued a permanent no-contact order between my mother and Julie. He called what they did egregious child abuse that weaponized an innocent child's disability for their own purposes. The courtroom was completely silent as he continued with more details of the ruling. He ordered Jessica to pay for all of Julie's therapy costs going forward, plus my legal fees from this hearing. He scheduled a review hearing in 6 months to check on progress. Then he looked directly at Jessica and warned that any violation of his orders would result in immediate jail time. Jessica started sobbing while her lawyer tried to explain what everything meant. Outside the courthouse, my siblings were waiting by the steps, and I wasn't sure if they wanted to fight or apologize. My sister came up first and said she was sorry for not believing me right away. My older brother said the same thing and asked if he could still see Julie sometimes. My younger brother stayed back and said he needed time to process everything that happened. My youngest sister just looked at me and said, "Our family would never be the same, but maybe some parts could heal." That evening, Julie and I went home together for the first time in weeks, without supervision or worry. She asked me if Mommy was mad at her while we made dinner together in our kitchen. I told her Mommy needed to learn better ways to be a parent, and it wasn't Julie's fault. We read 3 books before bed, and I tucked her in with both Mr. Snuggles and the Build-A-Bear she'd carried to court. She fell asleep, holding both of them tight. A week later, Jessica had her first supervised visit at a therapeutic visitation center downtown. The supervisor called me afterward to report that Jessica had followed all the rules, but seemed disconnected from Julie. Julie had wanted to play, but Jessica mostly just sat there watching her. The therapist said this was normal after everything that happened, and rebuilding their relationship would take a long time if it was even possible. Over the next few weeks, my mother tried calling my siblings constantly to turn them against me. My brother told me she was staying with a cousin 3 states away and still insisted she'd done nothing wrong. She kept saying she was protecting Julie and that someday everyone would see the truth. Most of my siblings had seen enough evidence to know better and stopped taking her calls. Some people never learn or admit when they're wrong. 6 weeks after the ruling, Julie started showing real improvement in her therapy sessions. She stopped asking if she was in trouble every time she saw her therapist. She started talking about how visits with Mommy made her feel instead of just saying what she thought people wanted to hear. The therapist said her progress was remarkable, considering everything she'd been through with the coaching and confusion. 2 months passed before HR finally called me back to the office for a meeting about returning to work. The HR director sat across from me with a thick folder and started going through all the documentation I'd provided about the court case and the false allegations. She told me the company fully supported me and understood what I'd been through with the coaching situation. My direct supervisor joined the meeting halfway through and said everyone on the team had been asking when I'd be back. He mentioned that 3 other people in the department had gone through messy custody battles, and they all wanted me to know they understood. The paperwork took another hour, but by the end, they cleared me to return the following Monday with full reinstatement and no loss of seniority. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in months, because having a normal schedule would help both Julie and me get back to regular life. That first day back at work felt strange, but good as co-workers stopped by my desk throughout the morning to welcome me back. One guy from accounting pulled me aside at lunch and told me about his own custody nightmare from 5 years ago and how his ex had tried similar tactics. Another woman from my team shared that her brother went through false allegations, and it took 2 years to clear his name completely. By the end of the week, I'd heard at least 6 different custody battle stories from people I'd worked with for years, but never knew had gone through similar situations. The district attorney's office called my lawyer 3 weeks later with their final decision on criminal charges. The prosecutor explained they'd reviewed all the evidence, including the recordings and the forensic interview results, but ultimately decided not to pursue charges against Jessica or my mother. She said, prosecuting family members for coaching was extremely difficult, especially when the child involved had a disability that could complicate testimony. The prosecutor also mentioned that Julie's age made it nearly impossible to have her testify again without causing more trauma. My lawyer wasn't surprised and reminded me that the family court ruling gave us everything we needed to protect Julie. I wanted them to face consequences for what they did, but realized that Julie's healing mattered more than my desire for justice. 3 months after the custody ruling, Jessica's lawyer contacted mine to request a modification hearing. She'd completed all 12 weeks of her court-ordered parenting classes and wanted to move from supervised to unsupervised visits with Julie. The therapist at the visitation center wrote a detailed report saying Jessica had been appropriate during all visits, but recommended continuing supervision for at least 3 more months. She noted that Julie still showed signs of anxiety before visits and needed the security of having a professional present. The modification hearing only took 30 minutes, with the judge reviewing all the reports and agreeing with the therapist's recommendation. Jessica's lawyer argued that she'd done everything required, but the judge said Julie's needs came first, and 3 more months of supervised visits wouldn't hurt anyone. Around that same time, Julie started bringing up her grandma during our bedtime routine. She'd ask why Grandma couldn't come to her school play or why we didn't visit Grandma's house anymore. The therapist had prepared me for these questions and helped me practice age-appropriate responses. I told Julie that Grandma had made some bad choices that hurt people, and because of those choices, she couldn't visit us right now. The therapist suggested using simple terms Julie could understand without going into details about the coaching. Julie seemed to process this better than I expected, and after a few conversations, she stopped asking as often. My relationship with my siblings started changing gradually over those months too. My older brother began calling every few weeks to check in, and eventually asked if he could bring his kids over to play with Julie. My sister started texting me updates about family events, even though I wasn't attending most of them yet. One brother stayed polite but distant when we ran into each other at the grocery store and made small talk for exactly 2 minutes before leaving. My youngest sibling had completely cut contact and blocked me on everything after deciding I must have done something to make Mom and Jessica act that way. The 2 siblings who visited regularly brought their kids over every other weekend, and Julie loved playing with her cousins in the backyard. We never talked about Mom or the trial during these visits, but focused on letting the kids be kids and trying to build something new from what was left of our family. The 6-month review hearing arrived faster than expected, with the courtroom much emptier than our previous appearances. Julie's therapist testified first about the significant progress in therapy, with Julie showing age-appropriate behaviors and no signs of ongoing trauma. The guardian ad litem presented reports from Julie's teacher saying she was doing well academically and had made several friends in her special needs classroom. The visitation supervisor confirmed that Jessica had followed all rules during supervised visits and hadn't attempted any inappropriate conversations with Julie. After hearing all the testimony, the judge maintained my full custody, but granted Jessica 2 hours of unsupervised visits every Saturday afternoon. He scheduled another review in 6 months and reminded Jessica that any violations would result in immediate return to supervised visits only. Jessica looked different at this hearing compared to 6 months ago without the confident smirk or dramatic gestures. Her lawyer mentioned she was in therapy herself and working 2 jobs to keep up with child support payments. She thanked the judge quietly when he granted the unsupervised visits and made eye contact with me for the first time since the trial. Maybe she was actually learning from her mistakes, or maybe this was just another act, but only time would tell if the changes were real. The judge asked to speak with me privately after the hearing ended and the courtroom cleared. He told me he'd seen too many parents use their children as weapons, but rarely saw someone protect their child while still ensuring the other parent stayed involved. He extended the no-contact order with my mother indefinitely and scheduled our final review hearing for 1 year out. Before leaving, he said the legal battle was essentially over and we could all focus on moving forward. That night after dinner, Julie climbed into my lap while we watched cartoons and said something that stopped me cold. She looked up at me with those big eyes and said she loved me more than Disney World. The weight of that statement hit me hard because Disney had been the promised reward for lying about me in court. I hugged her tight and told her we could go on a different adventure instead, like camping where we could see real bears, not stuffed ones. She got so excited about the idea of seeing actual forest animals and immediately started asking if we could roast marshmallows and sleep in a tent. 2 weeks later, I kept that promise and took Julie on her first camping trip to a state park 2 hours away. She couldn't stop talking the entire drive about what animals we might see and whether bears really lived in the woods, like in her storybooks. We set up our tent together with Julie holding the stakes while I hammered them in, and she insisted on helping arrange our sleeping bags inside. That first night, she was scared of the dark and the strange noises, but by morning, she was running around collecting pine cones and pointing at every squirrel, like it was the most amazing thing she'd ever seen. We hiked a short trail where we actually saw a deer, and Julie stood completely still watching it until it bounded away into the trees. The campfire that night was her favorite part, as we roasted hot dogs and made s'mores while I taught her silly camp songs my dad had taught me decades ago. When we got home, she couldn't wait to tell everyone at the school about seeing a real deer and how marshmallows taste better when you cook them on a stick over a real fire. 3 weeks after the camping trip, the therapist called me about Jessica's progress in her supervised visits and suggested we could try letting her see Julie without supervision for 2 hours on Saturdays. I watched from my car that first Saturday as Jessica picked Julie up from the visitation center, both of them walking to the park across the street while I followed at a distance just to be sure. Julie came back smiling and talking about feeding ducks. No mention of court or bad memories, just a simple afternoon with her mom. The therapist said Jessica was following every boundary perfectly, never bringing up the past, just being present with Julie like we'd all hoped she could learn to do. My lawyer's office called the next Monday with an envelope from my mother's attorney containing a 4-page letter where she claimed she'd been protecting Julie from what she thought was real danger. I read it once, photocopied it from my files, then shoved it in the folder with all the other court documents without responding, because some people never admit they were wrong. Julie's therapy sessions dropped to twice a month by November, since she'd stopped talking about the practice stories completely, and her teacher sent home a progress report showing she was doing great in reading and making friends. The special education team said kids with Down syndrome often bounce back faster than people expect when they have stable support, and Julie was proving them right every day. Christmas came and went peacefully with Jessica taking Julie for a few hours on Christmas Eve to exchange gifts, while I spent the time organizing Julie's room and wrapping her presents from me. By March, a full year after that horrible day in court, we'd found our rhythm with Jessica's visits happening every weekend without problems, my work schedule back to normal, and Julie thriving in ways I hadn't dared hope for. One night while making dinner, Julie looked up from her coloring and asked if families could be different shapes like her friend, who had 2 moms at the school. I told her families came in all shapes and sizes, that some kids lived with grandparents, some with 1 parent, some with 2, and our family was exactly the right shape for us. She smiled and drew a heart on her paper, pointing at it and saying, "Our family was shaped like a heart," which made me turn away to wipe my eyes while stirring the pasta. The 1-year review hearing in April took less than 30 minutes with everyone agreeing the current arrangement was working perfectly. Jessica's therapist testified she'd made real progress. The guardian ad litem said Julie was well-adjusted and happy, and my lawyer presented a year of perfect compliance from everyone involved. The judge looked through all the reports, nodded, and closed our case file permanently with no more required check-ins, saying he was pleased to see a family finding their way forward after such a difficult start. That weekend, my sister called asking if she could bring her kids over for a barbecue since the weather was nice, and she missed seeing Julie. I bought burgers and hot dogs, cleaned up the backyard, and watched Julie run around with her 3 cousins, while my sister and I sat on the deck, carefully talking about everything except our mother or the trial. The kids played tag and blew bubbles while we grilled, and for a few hours it felt like we were a normal family having a normal Saturday, even if we all knew things would never be quite the same. After everyone left and I'd cleaned up the dishes, I carried Julie upstairs for her bath and bedtime routine, noticing how much she'd grown in the past year. She picked out her pajamas with the unicorns on them, brushed her teeth while I watched, then climbed into bed clutching both her Build-A-Bears, the old one and the new one I'd bought her after the trial ended. I pulled the covers up to her chin and sat on the edge of her bed like I did every night, and she looked at me with those big eyes and said she was happy and felt safe now. That's all I'd ever wanted from the beginning, just my daughter feeling secure, and loved, and every recording device, every court appearance, every fractured family relationship was worth it for this quiet moment of peace in her bedroom, with the nightlight casting soft shadows on the wall. Thanks for sticking with me through all this. It's definitely been a journey worth sharing. Until we meet again, folks. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.